On Christmas Eve, the streets glittered with fairy lights, windows glowed with warmth, and the air was filled with the promise of families gathering together. I had packed my car with carefully chosen gifts, tied each ribbon by hand, and drove. For hours, through the falling snow, smiling to myself at the thought of arriving unannounced. I imagined the surprise on their faces, the laughter, the hugs, the joy of being together again after so long. But the moment I pulled into the driveway, I felt something was wrong. The house was lit, music faintly spilled from inside, yet no one came to greet me. Then, through the blur of snowflakes, I saw her, my daughter, standing alone in the yard, her tiny frame trembling violently against the icy wind. Her thin jacket clung to her. Her little hands were blue from the cold, and her wide eyes locked onto mine as if she had been waiting for me, shivering, forgotten, left outside while everyone else celebrated inside. In that instant, my heart shattered, and the Christmas I thought I was walking into turned into a nightmare I would never forget. I froze on the spot, gripping the handle of my car door so tightly I could feel the cold metal burning my palm. My daughter's lips were pale, her breath clouding the air in desperate little bursts, and all I could think was how long she had been standing there, how long no one inside had cared enough to check. I rushed forward, scooping her into my arms, her tiny body stiff from the cold as she buried her face against my shoulder. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice breaking, and those two syllables cut deeper than any blade. I pushed open the front door without knocking, carrying her into the warmth, and what I saw inside nearly made me drop her. The living room was glowing with Christmas lights, a fire crackling, the table crowded with food, drinks, laughter, and not a single person had noticed she was missing. My husband looked up from his glass of wine, startled, as if I were the intruder, as if I had no right to be angry. My mother-in-law was busy handing out gifts, smiling, her hands covered in gold rings, while my daughter had been left to freeze in the snow. For a moment, everything in me went silent. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I just held my child tighter, staring at the people who called themselves family, and knew something inside me had shifted forever. I lowered my daughter onto the couch and wrapped her in the blanket that had been carelessly thrown aside by one of the cousins, still laughing over a new gadget he'd unwrapped. Nobody moved. Nobody rushed forward to help her, to apologize, to show even the faintest sign of shame. My husband finally set down his glass, clearing his throat like he was about to explain away the unforgivable, but I cut him off with just one look. My daughter clutched the blanket like it was armor, her little hands trembling, and her eyes darted nervously between me and the family she'd been abandoned by. The betrayal in that room was suffocating. I had spent years trying to fit in, trying to smooth over the cracks between me and his family, convincing myself that one day they'd treat me as their own. But seeing my child out there in the snow while they sat in warmth and abundance, that was the moment it all crystallized. They would never change. And worse, he would never stand up for us. I asked, my voice calm but sharp, "How long was she outside?" No one answered. My mother-in-law busied herself with adjusting the bow on another present. My sister-in-law took a long sip of her wine, and my husband shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I repeated, louder this time, "How long was she outside?" My daughter buried her face in the blanket, and I knew I'd never forgive them for making her feel invisible. I wasn't just furious. I was done. Done pretending, done playing nice, done sacrificing myself and my child's safety for the sake of appearances. That night wasn't just the end of Christmas. It was the beginning of my revenge. I sat there with my daughter pressed against me, feeling her cold fingers slowly warming under the blanket, and every second that passed without an answer from them was like poison running through my veins. I looked around at the people I had once called family. My husband's mother, who always treated me like a stranger in my own home. His sister, who mocked everything from the way I dressed to the way I raised my child. And the man I had married, who sat in his chair with his eyes glued to the floor, as if the truth might vanish if he refused to meet my gaze. The silence was unbearable, so I filled it myself. "She could have died out there," I said, my voice steady but so sharp it cut through the laughter that had been echoing seconds before. "While you all sat here with your wine and your gifts, she was shivering in the snow." Still, nothing. Not one apology. not even a flicker of regret. And in that moment, I understood something cruel and simple. They didn't forget her. They left her out there on purpose. My daughter was my shadow, my anchor, my everything. But to them, she was just a reminder that I existed, that I had married into their perfect family, and they wanted her out of sight. Rage built in my chest like a storm, but I didn't let it show. I didn't scream. I didn't break. I smiled instead, a quiet, dangerous smile that none of them seemed to notice because they were too busy avoiding my eyes. I tucked my daughter closer, kissed the top of her head, and whispered to her so only she could hear, "It's going to be different now. I promise." And I meant it. They had just written their own ending, and I was going to be the one to deliver it. The night dragged on in a haze of fake laughter and clinking glasses, but I wasn't really there anymore. I was cataloging everything. The way my husband barely looked at our daughter, the smug tilt of his mother's chin as if daring me to cause a scene, the way his sister whispered behind her hand while glancing at me with a smirk. I didn't need them to tell me what they thought of me. Their actions screamed it louder than words ever could. But I stayed quiet, letting them believe I was too stunned, too humiliated to act. They didn't know I had been planning my exit long before this night. I had watched the way money moved in and out of the family's accounts, how my husband relied on me to handle the paperwork he was too careless to check. I had seen the loopholes, the signatures he'd left blank, the documents his family never bothered to read because they trusted him to keep control. And I had quietly made sure that control was no longer his alone. Every detail, every oversight, I had tucked away like ornaments in a box, waiting for the day I would need them. That day had arrived, and they had delivered the final push themselves, when they left my daughter to freeze. I stood up in the middle of their celebration, my daughter still wrapped in the blanket, and announced that we were leaving. The room fell silent, all eyes suddenly on me. My husband finally spoke, his voice slurred from the wine. "You're not going anywhere," he said, half command, half plea. But I didn't even look at him. I just smiled again, calm and deliberate, and replied, "Watch me." I walked toward the door with my daughter clinging to my hip, her little face still pressed against my shoulder, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight sliding off me instead of crushing me. My husband stumbled up, reaching for my arm, but I shifted away so quickly he caught only the edge of my coat. "You're not making a scene in front of my family," he hissed through clenched teeth, his breath sour with alcohol. I looked him dead in the eyes and whispered back, "This is not a scene. This is the truth." His mother shot to her feet, clutching her pearls as if I had committed some crime by daring to leave. "How dare you walk out in the middle of Christmas dinner?" she snapped. "You will sit back down. You will not ruin this night for everyone else." Everyone else. That was always her refrain. Their comfort, their image, their perfect little traditions. Never my child, never me. I didn't argue. I didn't waste my words on people who had already proven they were deaf to anything that wasn't about them. I simply turned the handle and stepped into the cold night, the snow still, falling thick and heavy, the sound of music and laughter muffled behind the closed door. My daughter lifted her head, her eyes searching mine, and I kissed her temple. "We're free now," I whispered, and in that moment I meant it with every fiber of my being. They thought they had the power, but what they didn't know was that I had already secured mine. The house, the accounts, even a share in the family business, documents signed in carelessness, tucked away in safe places they didn't bother to check, were already in my hands. Tonight wasn't just about leaving. Tonight was about ending their reign over us, piece by piece, until all they had left was the memory of the family they thought they controlled. Snow crunched under my boots as I carried my daughter to the car, each step steady, deliberate, as if the weight of the moment was anchoring me to the ground. I buckled her in, tucked the blanket around her, and for the first time that night, I saw relief in her eyes instead of fear. She trusted me to keep her safe, and I silently vowed never again to let anyone make her feel unwanted. As I slid into the driver's seat, I saw them gathering at the window, shadows behind the glass, faces twisted in outrage that I had dared to leave. My husband stormed outside, his coat hanging loose over his shoulders, calling after me with that same mixture of arrogance and desperation I had come to know too well. "You can't just walk away from this," he shouted. his voice muffled by the falling snow. I rolled down the window just enough for him to see my face. "I already did," I said softly, and drove off before he could answer. The road stretched, dark and endless ahead, but I wasn't afraid, because in my glove compartment lay the folder I had kept hidden for months, copies of deeds, bank statements, contracts, proof of his recklessness, proof of their blind trust, proof that while they toasted themselves with wine and cruelty, I had been building the escape route brick by brick. They thought I was weak. They thought I was silent. They thought they could push me to the edge and I'd stay there, obedient, grateful for scraps. They were wrong. And as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I knew they would learn just how wrong very soon. The next morning, while they were probably still nursing hangovers and wrapping themselves in smug self-importance, I was already in motion. I dropped my daughter off with my sister, the only person who had ever stood by me, and drove straight to the lawyer's office where my folder of documents was waiting like a weapon freshly sharpened. Every signature my husband had scribbled without reading, every form his family had ignored because they believed they were untouchable, was now mine to wield. I sat across from the lawyer as he flipped through the pages, his eyebrows lifting higher with each one. "You realize," he said finally, "this gives you partial control over their holiday rental properties, a significant portion of the business, and even leverage over the main house." I nodded, calm, steady, as if I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 1,000 times, because I had. For years, I had been their scapegoat, the outsider who didn't belong, the woman they sneered at while they drained my energy and dismissed my voice. But now, with a single envelope of papers, the power dynamic had shifted. My husband called me that afternoon, his voice dripping with forced charm. "Come back home. Let's talk about this like adults. You don't want to escalate things." I let him talk, let him spin his empty words, and when he finally paused, I answered, "It's already escalated. You should have thought about that before you left our daughter in the snow." There was a silence on the line so thick I could almost hear his family behind him, whispering, panicking, realizing the empire they had guarded so jealously was now crumbling at the hands of the woman they underestimated the most, and for the first time, I felt no fear. Only resolve. The fallout began faster than even I expected. Within a week, the rental properties that had always been their pride, the cozy cabins they bragged about at every dinner party, were legally frozen because of the filings I had pushed through with my lawyer. Their tenants, who had always been treated as an afterthought, started calling me directly now because my name was on the paperwork they never bothered to check. I listened to their complaints with patience, promised them change, and for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't powerless and I was in control. My husband showed up at my sister's house one evening, his eyes bloodshot, his charm stripped away. He didn't even ask to see our daughter first. He went straight into demands. "You think you can take what's mine? You won't last a month without me," he said, his voice shaking more from fear than anger. I looked him dead in the eyes and replied, "You left her outside in the snow. You lost everything the second you did that." He flinched, and I knew he felt the truth of it. His mother called next, her voice a mix of venom and desperation. "You're destroying this family," she accused. I almost laughed at the irony. "I'm not destroying anything," I answered. "I'm just taking back what you tried to bury me under." And then came the letters, notices from the bank, tax inquiries, all of it piling up because without me quietly holding things together in the background, their perfect image was unraveling thread by thread. Each call, each visit, each panicked message was proof that the tables had turned. They thought they had caged me, but it was them who were trapped now, clawing at the walls I built around their empire, realizing too late that I had the key all along. By the time January settled in, the cracks in their perfect facade had become gaping holes. The rental cabins were no longer producing income, creditors were circling, and whispers had started to spread around town. People who used to envy their picture-perfect Christmas parties were now murmuring about lawsuits, about unpaid bills, about how the Golden family wasn't quite so golden anymore. I didn't need to start the rumors. Their arrogance had done that for me. But I made sure the truth was documented, filed, and impossible to ignore. My husband's sister, who had sneered at me for years, called in a panic after her credit. Card was declined at a boutique she loved flaunting. "You've ruined us," she screamed into the phone. I stayed quiet until her voice cracked and then said evenly, "You did that yourselves when you left my daughter outside." Then I hung up because I no longer owed them explanations. My husband grew desperate enough to try charm again. He showed up with flowers, with gifts for our daughter, pretending he wanted to reconcile, but the flowers wilted untouched, and my daughter refused to even look at him. She remembered. Children always remember how you make them feel. And while he was scrambling, I was moving forward, transferring accounts into my own name, securing custody arrangements with my lawyer, and taking full ownership of what they had thoughtlessly signed away. The final blow came when the judge looked at the contracts and, with a firm voice that echoed in the courtroom, confirmed that I owned half of their family company. The color drained from their faces, his mother's, his sister's, all at once, like they had seen a ghost. In that moment, the balance of power shifted completely, and they knew there was no undoing it. The courtroom was colder than the snow I had carried my daughter through that Christmas Eve, but I sat there with my back straight, my hands folded, neatly in my lap, and my lawyer's words echoing like a hammer with every document he laid before the judge. My husband tried to argue, tried to frame me as hysterical, ungrateful, even unstable. But every time he opened his mouth, another piece of paper was produced. His signature, his negligence, his proof of carelessness. His mother sat behind. Him, lips pursed so tightly they were white, while his sister dabbed at her eyes as if tears might sway the court. None of it mattered. Facts don't cry, facts don't tremble, facts stand steady, and I had collected every single one. When the judge ruled that I was not only entitled to full custody, but also held controlling rights over half their company, the silence in the room was absolute. My husband's smirk finally collapsed into something small, something weak, the mask of power he'd always worn stripped away in seconds. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, as though it were the only natural outcome, because it was. Outside the courthouse, reporters lingered, drawn by the whispers of a family collapse that no one thought possible. His mother rushed past them with her coat shielding her face. His sister stumbled, trying to avoid the questions. And my husband, he just stood there, looking at me like he no longer recognized the woman he had once thought he owned. I took my daughter's hand, warm now, strong, steady, and walked past them without a word. That silence was my victory, louder than any scream or accusation. They had left her in the snow. I left them in the ruin of their own making. In the weeks that followed, their downfall became impossible to hide. The glossy image they had polished for years cracked in full view of everyone who once admired them. Former business partners began to distance themselves quietly, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. Invitations to charity galas, the ones my mother-in-law flaunted as proof of her social standing, stopped arriving. Even the Christmas cards that had once filled their mailbox dwindled to nothing, replaced by letters from lawyers, debt collectors, and banks demanding answers. My husband moved back into his mother's house, the very place where he had once lorded his power over me, now reduced to pacing through its hallways like a ghost. I heard whispers that his sister had to sell her car just to cover her share of the family's crumbling finances. Meanwhile, I focused on building something real. I poured my energy into the part of the business that was now legally mine, restructuring it with the efficiency they had always dismissed me for. I reached out to the tenants they had ignored, restoring their trust, and soon the cabins started turning profit under my management. For the first time, people spoke to me with respect, not because of whose wife I was, but because of what I had built. At school, my daughter began to smile again. She told her teacher that Mommy always keeps her warm now, and when I heard those words, I knew that no amount of money, no legal victory, no crumbling empire could ever compare to that. But I won't lie. There was satisfaction in knowing that every time they drove past the properties with my name on the deeds, every time they answered another creditor's call, every time they looked at me across a courtroom or through a headline, they were reminded of the night they left my little girl outside in the snow. That single choice had rewritten their legacy, and I was the one holding the pen. I never imagined that one Christmas night would be the turning point of my entire life. But now, looking back, I see it so clearly. That moment when I found my daughter outside in the snow was more than just betrayal. It was revelation. It showed me who they truly were and who I had allowed myself to become by staying silent for so long. But I am not silent anymore. They thought I would crumble, that I would run back to them begging for scraps of acceptance, but instead I built a life where their shadows no longer touch me. My daughter and I have a home filled with warmth and laughter, not the kind you put on for show, but the kind that grows naturally when no one is watching. The company they mocked me for taking an interest in now flourishes under my hand, and their names, once untouchable in our town, are spoken with pity instead of envy. My husband's arrogance has withered into bitterness. His mother's pride has curdled into silence, and his sister's gossip has turned inward because no one listens anymore. They lost everything they tried to hoard, while I gained the only things that ever mattered: safety, independence, and dignity. Sometimes, when the snow falls thick outside our window, my daughter asks me if I remember that night, and I tell her yes, I always will. Not because of the pain, but because it was the night I chose us over them. The night I stopped begging to be seen and decided to make myself undeniable. They left my little girl to freeze, but in doing so, they set fire to their own legacy. And from the ashes, I built something stronger, something untouchable. I don't need their approval. I don't need their love. I have my daughter's hand in mine, and that is more than enough.